Good day, and welcome to the third Force Preparatory Fitness Program presentation. Today, we'll be going through the Rush and ILS cardio portions of the program. These are scheduled for Tuesdays and Thursdays respectively if you're going through the 5-day training program in our recommended sequence. Just a reminder to prioritize your days if you're unable to commit to those 5 days a week, and that's in order to enhance your chances for force-related benefits. If you need to work on either the Rush or the ILS, we strongly encourage you to include both of these sessions, especially during blocks A and B, into your training week. And this is to remain consistent with the strengthening the forces injury reduction strategies for sport and physical activity. This strategy states that prior to incorporating any form of high-intensity running training into your program, you require 8 weeks of running base at a minimum in order to minimize your risk of becoming injured. This concept will be discussed a little bit later in this presentation. Additionally, the rush technique that we recommend requires significant mobility in terms of hip flexion to get in and out of that deep lunge position that we recommend for the rush technique. It is imperative that we practice the recommended techniques as we train so that it overrides the previous movement patterns that we've been normalized to. If you're lacking in the fundamental mobility to get into this position, on top of including the ILS and the Rush cardio days, we strongly encourage you to include the flexibility, mobility, and stability programming into your workout plan, especially that lower body one, and doing it most days of the week, if not more, if you want to improve on your mobility. The other important part of that program is the stability. Since we're doing a deep lunge position at maximal effort, we want to be stable in those joints to be able to support the load so that we don't get injured. Following this presentation, we're going to encourage you to watch the YouTube series on the rush progressions and the side-by-side technique comparison videos if you have not done so already. And that'll bring everything that I just said back together and make more sense if you're a little bit uncertain of what I'm talking about currently. They will be linked in the description below for your convenience. For now, let's get into the content of the Rush and the ILS cardio. Here we're going to start with blocks A and B as they are basically very similar. They're both going to be base building phases, unlike the rush strength that we discussed in the previous episode, which has a base building, a hypertrophy, and then a power phase. Here we have 8 consecutive weeks, if not more, of base building before we get into our high intensity interval phase. You'll notice that I amalgamated the two, so level 1, 2, and 3 are block A, and level 4 and 5 are block B. If you'll notice here, the effort is separated between brisk walk and light jog efforts, where each and every level increases the amount of time spent jogging within a consecutive bout. Remember that this program has been conceptualized for beginners and individuals who probably don't run very regularly. If you're in this program or listening to this presentation and you do run regularly, going back and following a program such as this may be a regression, and you may be losing some of your cardiovascular fitness if this intensity is not sufficient enough for you. As such, if you are an avid runner and run regularly at least 3 times a week for 30 minutes at a light to moderate effort and are able to do so, then you can certainly continue to do that form of training until you're ready to start block C. Otherwise, if you're new to running, regardless of how strong your cardiovascular base is, we encourage you to follow this progression in order to not only accustom your cardiovascular system to the nature of running, but your joints. That's really the big piece here. We're trying to reduce the risk of injury. So one of the things I want to highlight is the difference between brisk walk and light jog is not a cardiovascular difference. We should not see any peaks and valleys in our heart rates as we progress through the entire 24 minutes of continuous effort. The brisk walk should be fast enough that when you get to the light jog, it's the same intensity. What we're trying to accomplish here is to gradually increase the amount of time spent in a jogging form, which is high impact by nature, so that your muscles, your bones, and your joints can get accustomed to that repetitive pounding. And that will build that base to reduce your injury when we start to add speed and intensity in block C. So once again, with that being said, if you're accustomed to running and you run regularly, you may be able to do a little bit more than is written. I'm going to take a little bit of time to go through the strengthening the forces injury reduction strategies for sport and physical activity that I introduced in the first slide. What it states is to reduce your risk of injury before including high intensity interval training in the form of running. You should do 8 weeks of 30-minute sessions 3 times a week, continuous for those 8 weeks, remaining injury-free the entire time, and doing so at a light to moderate effort. If you hit all 5 of those checkpoints, then it is safe for you to start introducing higher intensity interval training, running specific, into your programming. What we do in our program is we kind of bridge the gap between the strengthening the forces recommendations and something that may be a little bit more realistic. So we only do 24 minutes twice a week. That's why, if you recall in the first slide, I recommended, regardless of whether your focus is ILS or rush, you should do both, because we're getting at least twice a week in here for blocks A and B. Once you get to block C, then you can specialize a little bit more, and that'll be discussed in the next slide. In order to coincide a little bit better with the strengthening the forces injury reduction strategies, you do have the option to change that 24-minute warm-up into a 30-minute warm-up. So for example, at level 1, instead of doing 8 rounds, I would simply do 10 rounds of 2 minutes of brisk walk, 1 minute of light jog effort, and that's my 30 minutes right there. And if you want, and if you have the time, you are strongly encouraged to do this 3 times a week instead of 2 times a week. If you're following our 5-day-a-week training plan, these sessions are done on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so you can add an additional one of these sessions on Saturday or Sunday, whichever day you prefer. And then you'll definitely be putting your best foot forward in terms of reducing your risk of injury when you get into block C. If you're only following our recommended minimum of twice a week, 24 minutes, just note that you are building your base, but it may not be the most substantial base, and you will have a slightly increased risk of injury when compared to your counterparts who may be doing those 3 30-minute sessions. And as always, if you do get injured during either block A or B because you're running too much, then you should not progress or proceed into block C. The levels I want to talk a little bit more about. You do not have to progress in the manner that we suggest from week to week. That is just our recommended progression. If you're noticing that by level 3 it's adequately challenging, you can stay there for the entire duration, and that's totally okay. However, we would strongly encourage you to try to push through and to do a little bit more so long as there is no pain and your cardiovascular system can support it. You're not huffing and puffing or going significantly out of breath during those running bouts, and your heart rate isn't spiking and going back down. Additionally, if you need more time and you want to continue progressing, try level 6, where you're doing 15 minutes of continuous effort jogging with 2 minutes of walking in between. Or level 7, where you're doing 20 minutes continuous, all the way to your ability to do 30 minutes continuous. Otherwise, if you're happy with your progressions, once you've done level 5, feel free to move on to block C. I'll draw your attention now to the line that's under the graph, which states that you may replace with a spin bike for a lower impact option. This is great to build your cardiovascular base. However, it will not work towards building your resistance to shock in terms of your muscles, your bones, and your joints adapting to that high impact nature of running. Therefore, if you're choosing the spin bike option, we do not recommend you proceed on to block C at any time, because your joints will not be adapted to the high impact nature of running, and therefore we don't want to add that speed in training overload over a significant amount of weeks. You can certainly attempt it as a one-off during the actual force test, and that may be safe to do so. With that being said, the spin bike, you'll still get a lot of cardiovascular benefits. You just won't be able to practice the specific technique in the actual testing modality. So you'll be at a little bit of a setback in terms of speed and efficiency, but your cardio should still be right there. And it is a great option to improve your cardiovascular ability to succeed in the force test without needing to do a high impact option. Once you've done the 24 minutes or 30 if you chose to do so, take 15 or 20 minutes to round out the workout by proceeding through the rush progressions. If you haven't watched the rush technique videos, do so at the end of this video to bring to light what they look like. They're going to be the same ones that you do on the rush strength days, and this just gives you so much more time to continue to practice and perfect them so that by the time you get to block C, you're good to go and you know how to do the program or how to do the technique. Once you're done with that, do a quick cool down, 5 minutes brisk walk or light jog with 5 minutes of stretching. That's it for blocks A and B. Let's move along to block C. If you recall, block C is our high intensity interval training phase where we start including the ILS and the rush as the specific modality at a high intensity over a repeated amount of times. You're safe to start this block once you've completed 8 weeks of at least twice a week, ideally 3 times a week, easy jogging intervals where you've built your base up and you've remained injury-free. Once you start with block C, every single session is going to start with a warm-up. Part A is a cardio warm-up where you do 10 minutes of continuous walk-jog effort. Do so at the level where you ended off block A and B. So if you finished and you went all the way to level 5, then you're comfortable doing a 10 minutes of continuous jog. So go ahead and do that as part of your warm-up. Let's say you only made it to level 3 injury-free, then your warm-up would look as 1 minute of walk, 2 minute of jog, and repeat until you've accumulated 10 minutes. Once you've done that, your cardio is up, your heart rate's a little bit high, you're sweating a little bit, you're ready to start doing some dynamic stretches. We recommend 3 rounds of high knee skips, bump skips, and C skips. These not only warm up the muscles dynamically, but they act as a way to improve our running mechanics when done properly. There is a video on how to do these and it is linked in the description below. So to get more info on how to do those, please click the video and watch those. Once you've done your cardio and your dynamic, you're ready to activate. We activate it by doing 4 20-meter prone sprints. The first at 60% max effort, working our way up to 90% max effort by the last one. In order to practice our technique, let's do 2 facing forwards, which practices are leaving the straightaway lines. And let's do 2 facing backwards, which practices leaving the turnaround lines. Once you're activated, you're ready to start working out. Let's first talk about the ILS. Before, let's discuss what pieces of equipment you're going to want and need. So the setup for the ILS is actually quite simple. You're going to need 20 meters of space. You're going to need 2 cones to mark off the start and the 20-meter line. If you don't have cones, anything will do. I personally just use shoes that I'm not currently wearing at the time. And then you're going to need a 20-kilogram sandbag. Same thing here. If you don't have a sandbag, anything that's as close to or exactly 20 kilograms will do the trick. We recommend a backpack because that's going to be closer to the shape of a sandbag, but dumbbells, kettlebells, pots and pans, make it work for you. The ideal location is going to be indoors in a gymnasium. However, we may not all have access to that. Suitable alternatives include your backyard if it's long enough, your driveway if it's long enough. You can do this on the sidewalk or find a local park, maybe doing it on the grass or on the gravel if there's a gravel strip of road. Note that any difference in the flooring will affect your speed on this. And this is going to be important later on when we talk about pacing, so keep that in mind. If you're unable to do it outside due to your location or maybe the weather, then inside may work as well. However, we don't all have 20 meters in our house that we can go back and forth. So you may have to shorten it, which means you're going to do shorter back and forths. Once again, if you're doing this, it's going to significantly affect your speed, and therefore it's going to affect your goal time, which will be discussed a little bit later. So keep that in mind. The actual test, let's talk about how we do it. We're going to start behind the line with the sandbag on the floor, standing straight. We did have a video for this, however, my PowerPoint isn't allowing me to do some talking at the same time as a video is playing for some reason, so I'm just going to talk to it at this slide here. Pick up your sandbag and start walking as fast as you can to the 20-meter line. Notice the arrows. When you get to the cone, you must go completely around the cone and then back to the start. When you make it to the start, no, there are no arrows and there's no cone. Simply touch the line, drop the bag over the line, and then proceed on your unloaded shuttle where you are allowed to run. Same thing here, when you get to the cone, round it completely. Clockwise or counterclockwise, it doesn't matter. Proceed back to the start line, touch the line, and pick up your bag. When you do the actual test, we'll do this 10 times total. So 5 with the bag, 5 without the bag. However, when we're doing it in our training, we're doing it 6 times total. 3 with the bag, 3 without the bag. And we'll talk about pacing a little bit later as well. Keep that in mind when you're doing your training. Let's move right along to talk a little bit more about the periodization in Block C. Now that we've covered the setup and how to do the actual test, let's take a look at what the workout looks like. I'll draw your attention to this table where I denote level 1, level 2, level 3, and then in asterisks our recommended amount of time that you should spend in each block. Remember, these are only recommendations. So level 1, we recommend you spend 1 week here. We're going to do 4 intervals, taking a minute and a half rest in between each interval. 1 total interval is going to be 3 loaded and 3 unloaded shuttles, for a total of 6 shuttles, alternating loaded, unloaded every single time. And we're aiming for a goal pace of 6/10 your actual goal ILS pace, which will be discussed in the next slide. Level 2, we recommend that you move immediately into that after week 1, where we do 5 rounds or 5 intervals with a minute and a half rest in between each. And then for your last 2 weeks, if you're doing a 4-week block, we recommend that you do 6 rounds of your intervals with a minute and a half rest in between each. Note that I said if you're choosing to do a 4-week block. You may do a little bit more or a little bit less depending on how much time you have. The recommendation is that you build through this right up to your test. So if your test is a little bit further away or gets delayed and you need to turn this 4-week block into a 6-week block, that's okay. Here's our recommendation. Spend 2 weeks, 2 weeks at level 1, 2 weeks at level 2, and then 2 weeks at level 3. Or if you're feeling good, you can add more rounds. However, it may be taxing and you may be overtraining, so pay careful consideration to how your body is responding if you're doing more. And once again, if proceeding to the 6 rounds is too much, then don't worry about that. Stop at level 2 or stay at level 1. The goal is not to go faster, however. It's to stick within our expectation of how fast we can go, which is related to our goal pace and will be discussed a little bit later on. That's it for the ILS. Let's take a look at the rushes. As for the rushes, you're going to simply proceed with an out back as fast as you can, and these intervals are meant to be done on Thursdays. Much like we did with the ILS, let's look at the ideal setup before we go a little bit deeper into the specifics. All right, so the setup here is almost just as easy, just slightly more different than the ILS setup. You're going to also need a 20-meter space. However, there's no need for sandbags. we simply need to draw 3 lines. You can mark them off by cones, however, having an actual visible line is ideal here because you're going to need to touch the line every single time, and practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect. So as much as we can practice to the real conditions, the better we're going to put our feet forward to succeed when we get into the actual evaluation. Once again, I had a video for this that I was going to talk through that illustrates how to do this. However, PowerPoint isn't letting me do that, so we're just going to talk through how to approach the test right here on this slide. You start behind the start line on the ground, perpendicular to the line with your hands released on your stomach. At 3, 2, 1, go, stand up and run as fast as you can to the 10-meter line. It's important to do these next steps in order. You must first touch the line with your foot, then come down on your stomach and be perpendicular to the line, hand release behind the line or directly on top of the line. And that's measured by where your shoulders and your hands are. Once you've done that, you can get up and proceed to run to the 20-meter line. Hold yourself accountable. If you did not touch the line with your foot, get up and touch it again before doing your hand release. If you forgot your hand release, run back, do your hand release, and keep going. You need to train exactly like you're going to do the evaluation, and you need to hold yourself to as high of a standard as your force evaluator will in the actual test. When you get to the 20-meter line, proceed the same steps, but this time you get up and you turn around. 10-meter line again, and then run through the end. That's what we're going to be doing in our training. In the actual test, you'll hit the start line and do a second out back. But for training, it's just one out back. In terms of space, ideal location, once again, is a gymnasium. If you don't have access to that, I do not really recommend the same recommendations as the ILS, because doing those chest to floors, let's say in your driveway or on the sidewalk, is not going to be a fun time. So the best alternative that I can think of would be outside in a grassy soccer field or at a park. Depending on the weather, that may not be an option. So we can talk about different ways to modify this. Let your PSP staff know if you need help with that. But for now, we're going to finish off the slide and proceed with how to do the 4-week Block C training block. Much like we did with the ILS, let's take a closer look at this table for the rushes. Week 1, we recommend 6 rounds of an all-out, out-back rush interval at half goal rush pace, taking 1.5 minutes in between each bout of effort. Week 2, we recommend you do 8 rounds with 1.5 minutes rest in between each round. And weeks 3 and 4, we recommend 10 rounds. Let's say you wanted to do 6 weeks. Well, week 1 can be 6 rounds. Week 2 can be 7 rounds. Week 3 can be 8 rounds. Week 4 could be 9 rounds. And week 5 and 6 can be 10 rounds. We don't recommend staying here for much longer than 6 weeks due to the high impact and high interval nature or high intensity interval nature of this type of training will increase your risk of injury if you sustain this amount of effort for so long. However, doing 4 to 6 weeks should be appropriate. Ideally, you're testing right at the end once you're done this periodization block. That's it for the rushes. Let's talk a little bit more about what I mean by goal paces. All right, let's talk about goal paces. This is probably the most important part of training for the ILS and for the rushes. You'll notice the title here, it only says ILS interval goal pace. That's because the rushes one is super simple. You're gonna go out back as fast as you can, take that value, multiply it by 2, and you're hoping that that number is under your goal pace. So let's say my out back, I'm doing it in 20 seconds. Well then, multiplying that by 2, it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect that you can sustain that effort for the entire duration. So you should expect a total time of around 40 seconds, maybe a little bit slower, so between 40 and 43 seconds. So that's how you calculate your goal pace for the rushes. You just go as fast as you can and multiply that value by 2. Add 2 to 3 seconds, and that'll give you a reasonable expectation of what you can do for the actual test. But the ILS is a little bit more tricky. If you recall, and if you have the document in front of you, we're going at 6/10 goal pace. And what does that mean? Well, if you recall, the actual ILS test has 10 intervals, 5 with load, 5 without load. What we're doing is 3 with load, 3 without load. So we're doing 6 intervals. So what we're trying to achieve in our training is to hit that 6th interval at the time that we would hit our split time in the actual test. In the actual test, we'll proceed for another 4 intervals total to make the 10. But in our training, we're only doing 6, so we're aiming for 6/10 of our goal pace. And what does that look like? I'm going to do a simple maths right now before I show a little bit more. Let's say our goal pace is 100 seconds. That's 1:40. It's unrealistic. I don't think anyone's ever going to do that, but it makes math very simple. If my goal pace is 100 seconds, on my first 2 shuttles, I would aim for 20 seconds. Then my next 2, I'd be at 40 seconds. My 6/10 would be 60 seconds. Holding that pace, by the next 2, I'll be at 80 seconds, and then I'll finish off the last 2 at my 100 seconds, which is 1:40, and that's my goal time. So when I'm training, every time I get to that 6th interval, I want to be at 60 seconds. So let's take a look at what that may look for you, and let's figure out how we can calculate it so that it's easy to calculate. The first thing we want to do is draw our attention to the bottom left side of the screen where I have a best time and a goal time. This is just an example. Let's say this person has a best time of 3 minutes and 22 seconds. It wouldn't be unreasonable for them to have a goal time of 3:13, which is 9 seconds faster than their best ever recorded time. This person, maybe their goal time is 2:50, but we're not going to train for the 2:50 yet. We're going to train for the 3:13 when we get it, then we'll maybe train for the 3:05, and then we'll train for the 2:58, and then we'll train for the 2:50. We're going to take little chunks off of our best time and slowly, gradually work towards our ultimate goal time. However, we're always going to work with our intermediary goal time in between each. So, with a goal time of 3:13, how do I calculate 6/10? First thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to convert 3:13 into seconds, and that's a 2-step process. Take the minutes and multiply by 60 to get the minutes in value of seconds, and add the remainder seconds that we're missing. So in this case, I take the 3 multiplied by 60 and add 13. Now that I have my value in seconds, I'm going to multiply that entire thing by 0.6 to get 6/10 my goal pace represented in seconds. Convert it back to an easy reading format of minute per seconds. Step 4, I'm going to take my value, if it's between 60 and 119, I'm going to subtract 60 and put a 1 in front of it to represent 1 minute, and whatever the remainder is the seconds. If my value is between 120 and 179, I'm going to subtract 120, put a 2 in its place, and whatever's left is going to be the seconds after the 2. And there you have it. Let's take a look at what 3:13 looks like. And you'll see it got chopped off by my face there, but we can see the 5 steps represented pretty well. So step 1, 3 times 60 is 180. So 3 minutes is the same thing as 180 seconds. My goal pace is 3:13, so I need to add in the 13, which gives me 193 seconds. Now that I'm at step 4, I multiply that value by 0.6 to give me my goal pace, my goal 6/10 pace represented in seconds, which is 115.8. Now that's confusing to read, so how do I get that in a value of minutes per second? Since it's between 60 and 119, I'm going to subtract 60 And that's going to give me 55.8 seconds. Since I subtracted 60, I put the 1 minute in front of my remainder, and I get 1 minute 55.8. So when I do my 6 intervals, every single time when I finish, I want to be at 155.8 on my first round, on my second round, on my third round, and on my fourth round, if we're at level 1, for example. If we can do that for all of those with only a minute and a half rest in between, we're training our body to know how fast we need to go to hit 313. Then when we test, we can see whether we hit that goal or not and readjust our goal and try to go faster next time. That's it for how to goal pace. Now, let's go into the cool down. Everyone's favorite part, the cool down. 5 minutes of easy cardio, just like we talked about in the rush strength days, followed by 5 minutes of stretching. For blocks A and B, focus primarily on that lower body. However, depending on how far and how much work you did in the rush progressions, you may want to give a little bit of TLC to your upper body as well, specifically the chest muscles. As for block C, same thing, lifting that sandbag and doing those chest to floors, you're going to want to give a little bit of stretching to your upper body as well. Holding the stretches one time through for 20 to 30 seconds should suffice to help reoxygenate the blood in the working muscles and get rid of all the nasty byproducts that were created from working hard. We're not looking to improve our flexibility by stretching here, simply to start cooling down and speed up the rate of recovery so that we can get to our next workout feeling a little bit fresher. Before moving on to the next presentation, we recommend that you watch our side-by-side technique comparisons if you have not done so already, and that you take a look at the Rush Progression series as well if you haven't done so already. That's it for today. Thank you so much for joining.